Welcome back. So in the last video, then we ended here talking about the difference between heredity and heritability. So just a reminder, heredity is where we pass genes from parent to offspring, or parent to child. And heritability is measuring the differences in a population that's because of genetic differences. So how much is the differences in a population due to genetic differences? And how we measure heritability is this thing called a heritability coefficient. So the heritability coefficient is an estimate of how much a characteristic is due to genetic factors. In other words, the heritability coefficient tells us what percent of the differences in a population is because of genes. Now let's get some examples because I feel like the examples will really help, okay? So here's a table with just some examples of heritability coefficients. Sometimes they're called heritability estimates. It's the same thing, okay? Now the higher the number, or closer to 1, now I really want to stress this, that all heritability coefficients are from 0. Why is this not working? Is from 0 to 1. Okay? That's it. There's no no negatives, nothing bigger than 1. They're always between 0 and 1. Okay? And so a heritability factor of 0.8 means that it's mostly due to genes. So genes play a big role. The smaller the number, so for instance right here, this one is 0.28. That means it's less likely to be due to genes, okay? So 0.8 is more. And there we go, okay? Do you see how that works? So when we're talking about the trait now, so we're talking about height. So the variability in everyone's height in the world, 80% of what contributes to someone's height or to the height of people in the world is their genes. Okay, so that means 20%, or the opposite, is not due to genes. And then, so here agreeableness is the other one we talked about that has a low heritability coefficient. That means that agreeableness is not controlled for by genes very much, or the difference in the population in amount of agreeableness is controlled for by genes only 28%. So that means the majority of what makes up for the differences in the population of agreeableness is not the genetic differences. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, if we want to study the effects of heritability coefficients, how are we able to come up with these numbers? And there's two main ways. The first are adoption studies. So this is where we're able to look at the differences in how people grow up and the different traits, especially behavioral traits in people, based on how they grew up. Because in adoption studies, then the parents and the children will have different genes, but they'll have the same environment. Okay, so it's the combination of genes and environment that make up for something, right? Remember we talked about that with a couple of the different fields of psychology, how it's the combination of that. So with adoption studies, then we're looking at how does the environment affect someone, and then any differences that can come out would be attributed to biology, right? Now, the other type of study is twin studies. So here, this is just an example or showing you how it's possible for there to be identical twins versus fraternal twins. So in identical twins, you actually have one egg and one sperm that splits into two, whereas in fraternal twins, you have two eggs and two separate sperm. So they start separately. So that's why you're able to have different genes in fraternal twins, whereas identical twins will have the exact same genes. Okay, you don't need to know how all this works. That's just an explanation. But we can use twin studies and the differences between identical twins and fraternal twins to look at, again, the differences in genetic differences and environmental differences. And because it's hard to tell the difference between environmental effects and genetic effects, by using these twin studies, then we can actually tell the differences. So again, fraternal twins usually grow up in the same environment, so any differences between them would be due to genes. And then with identical twins, you can do studies with them because any differences between them would automatically have to be due to the environment. And so this could be different friend groups if they play different instruments, things like that. Also, we can do twin adoption studies. So there have been some cases where identical twins are adopted separately, and then you can then map them and see how they grow up and look at any differences or similarities between them. And again, any differences would be due to their environment and not genes. Okay? Now that's it for the genes that I want to cover. For the last of this, we're going to talk about evolution. Now, evolution is the passage of genetics over a long period of time and how genes kind of change over a long period of time. Okay? So first things first, what is evolution? So evolution is just the change in those heritable traits in a population over time. In other words, it's a change in those observable traits over a long period of time. So that could be change in hair color, the average hair color. That could be change in the average number of fingers, or change in a behavior of some sort, that kind of thing. And natural selection is a specific type of evolution, which is a process by which evolution occurs. And you can think of natural selection as the survival of the fittest. And this was first described by Darwin. So evolutionary psychology is a field of psychology we talked about a bit. And this is how have behavior and actions evolved in response to environmental demands. So the entire field of evolutionary psychology is based on the theory of evolution. So moving forward, what is the theory of evolution? And it's just a theory that states that a slow change in the genes of a population over time will occur. And because you have a change in the genes, you therefore have a change in the phenotypes, or there's physical characteristics. And remember, a population is a large set of individuals. And when talking about evolution in a biological sense, then we're talking about an interbreeding set of individuals. In other words, we're talking about groups of individuals that pass along their genes together. So that could be like a country. Nowadays it'd be kind of the whole world. But back in the day, then because it was harder to travel, then a population could be smaller. And it's only talking about the people that are breeding together or producing offspring together. Now there's changes, and these changes are due to mutations. In other words, we can't choose to change the DNA itself. It usually happens because of a mutation. And these are called heritable genetic mutations. In other words, it's a mutation that occurs in some offspring, kind of by mistake, and then that mutation is passed on to offspring over and over. And if it's a good mutation, it'll be selected for, and if it's a bad mutation, it'll be selected against. And that's where natural selection comes in. So a heritable characteristic that increases your likelihood of surviving will remain in the population and become more common over time. In other words, if the mutation is a good thing and it increases the likelihood of you producing more offspring and not being eaten by predators, it's going to stick around. Now, if it's a bad mutation that makes it easier for predators to see you, maybe it makes it harder for you to run away from predators, that trait's going to be selected against over time, which means it's not going to survive. And that's what natural selection is it's selecting those good mutations. So adaptions, that term, are the traits that occur due to natural selection. So some adaptions would be like in humans when we adapted opposable thumbs, so our movable thumbs. That's a good adaption that we have that our ancestors didn't have, right? Or there's some common examples in nature, such as giraffes. As trees got taller, then those that were taller, had longer necks, were able to eat, and those that had the trait of shorter necks or shorter legs could no longer eat and therefore did not survive. And because they didn't survive, then the trait of shortness kind of went away, and the trait of tall, long necks stayed around. There's other examples like, again, with beetles and birds. So in this example, crows love green beetles. Because they like green beetles, then the red beetles survive more than the green. And then over time, there's no longer going to be any green beetles because all the green beetles will be eaten and not able to pass on their genes. Same thing can happen in mice and other animals. Now, let's finish this up with talking about the human brain, because we're in psychology and that's what we care about. Now, the human brain itself has also been a subject of evolution. So we've seen growth in areas associated with higher mental processes. So that's like attention, memory, thought, and language. And that would really be those cortex areas, those 4 lobes. We've seen those get larger over time and been selected for. And that also then leads to the evolution of behavior that can be impacted by culture as well. So there are different types of adaptation. There's 2 main types I want you to know. One is a broad, and the second is domain specific. So a broad adaptation, based on its name, you might know that it's a very wide use. So you can use it. It's an adaptation that's good for a lot of things. So for instance, a larger cortex in the brain is a broad adaptation because it allows us to increase our language learning, logical reasoning, personality, a lot of different uses. Whereas a domain-specific adaptation is for a specific problem. So this would be like in Birds of Paradise or Brightly Colored Birds. They'll they'll adapt to have a specific color plumage for the sole purpose of attracting mates. There's only one purpose for that adaptation, and that's a domain specific. Now in humans, we also have some social adaptations. So we have this ability to acquire language, and this is something that's been adapted for over time. We also have this unique ability to be responsive to human faces. We have group-seeking behavior and some universal emotions. And these are all things that have been adapted for over time to make it easier to communicate and live and be better social animals. Now, finally, there are a few pitfalls of this. So we do have genetic determinism, which is the false idea that effects of genes are concrete and unchangeable. That's not true. Genes, they do determine some things. You can turn off some genes. We won't get into that too much, but just because you have a gene for something doesn't 100% mean you're going to have that phenotype. We also have social Darwinism, so that's the false idea that those on top of the social hierarchy are best. That's not always true. So this is survival of the fittest, and the less fit need to go. Sometimes those on top didn't get their fair and square, and adaptations of those on the bottom are just as good as those up top. So sometimes survival of the fittest isn't necessarily the best. And then we have the thought of defending the status quo, or that everything's fine, so why do we need evolution, right? Or because you develop a trait due to evolution, it must be a good trait, but that's not true. There are some traits we have that haven't really been selected against that aren't necessarily good. So you can even think of that as, say, your appendix. We have the appendix. Why? I don't know. It's not useful anymore, but it hasn't gone away. So, the defending the status quo thought would mean that we must keep our appendix, but we all know it's not necessarily needed, and if you're born without one, you're just as good.